So, ladies and gentlemen, that instruction I gave you applies to alleged statements at the side of the road on Route 1 in Topsfield and at the Topsfield Police Department. All right. Yes, please, Ms. McDougall.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In a loud, clear voice, can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Sure. Officer Joseph DiBernardo.
And how do you spell your first and last name, sir?
First name Joseph, last name DeBernardo.
And sir, how are you employed?
A full-time police officer with the town of Topsfield.
I'm just going to ask you to speak as if you're speaking to somebody out in the hallway.
Yes, sir, Your Honor.
Officer DiBernardo, how long have you been in that position?
Full-time, over 5 years, with the Topsfield Police, over 10.
And did you have any other employment in law enforcement or working for a law enforcement agency prior to joining Topsfield?
I did.
What was that?
I was actually a dispatcher with Danvers Police Department. I was also a correction officer in Middlesex County and Sheriff's Department. I also worked for college campuses as well.
And sir, drawing your attention to the shift that begins at midnight on October 22nd into October 23rd, were you working that shift?
I was.
And with whom were you working that shift on? And to be clear, the year is 2013.
Officer Neil Hovey.
Now, when you, do you remember about what time you arrived for your shift that night?
Just before midnight.
And you and Officer Hovey were the only officers on patrol that night, would that be fair to say?
After midnight, correct.
Okay. And at some point, were you dispatched to a particular location in the town of Topsfield?
We were.
And what location is that?
The location was Route 1 southbound. It was south of our police station. It was between South Main Street and Salem Road.
And are either of those roads which you used as markers particularly close to the location where you actually eventually stopped?
Yes.
Which one?
South Main Street.
And can you describe for us, please, the order in which yourself and Officer Hovey left the station that early morning when you got the call?
Absolutely. We have a garage in the basement of our station. The way we pull our patrol units in, my cruiser was the furthest in. Officer Hovey pulled out first, and I was second. I made sure I had to close the door and secure that door, and then I went off onto the call as well.
And what do you need to do to secure that door?
We just have a remote right on the visor. Hit the remote itself, electronically closes the door.
And I'm just going to ask you to keep your voice up a little bit.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when you pulled out of the station, where did you head?
At that point, once I turned southbound onto Route 1, towards that location on Route 1 south of South Main Street.
And can you describe for us what you observed as you made your way up the hill as you leave the police station?
As you make your way southbound on Route 1, the Topsfield Fairgrounds will be on your left-hand side. As you pass South Main Street, the area actually is poorly illuminated. You do approach a bridge that goes over the Ipswich River.
And what effect does the bridge have on the width of the road?
It actually bottlenecks. It tightens up. There's no shoulder. There's really no good area to be. So.
And let me ask you this. In general, sir, is there a sidewalk or a pedestrian walkway along that stretch of Route 1 in Topsfield?
No, there is not.
And typically, how do you handle pedestrians, people who are walking on Route 1, particularly when it's dark?
When it's dark, we try to provide a community caretaking function. We don't want to have anyone walking, any pedestrians on Route 1, especially at that nighttime. Route 1 is a poorly lit roadway. So.
And as you came around the area of that bridge, what, if anything, did you see?
At that point, Officer Hovey was making a three-point turn to reverse direction of his cruiser, and I observed a male party standing off to the shoulder of the road.
And was the male party moving or standing still at that time?
At that point, he kind of stopped walking.
Okay. Where was he facing, if you could see?
He was facing northbound, walking in the southbound lane of travel.
And do you literally mean he was standing facing northbound?
Correct.
Okay. And what steps did you take to then pull your vehicle in?
Safely made a three-point turn, reversing direction, facing northbound, pulling behind Officer Hovey's cruiser. And
was there an area for your two cruisers on the side of the road, or how were you parked with respect to the roadway?
Officer Hovey had to almost take up a lane at the bridge when he actually encountered the individual, and I actually was behind him, alleviating a little bit of distance in case of any moderate traffic, which at that time of night was still flowing, so we had to try to keep the area safe.
So where your cruiser was a little bit wider than where Officer Hovey's, would that be?
Slightly, yes.
And what did you do in terms of lighting when you stopped your cruiser?
Again, I activated my overhead blue lights. I wanted to signal any drivers who might be traveling northbound when they crest the hill to make the descent down, slow down due to our presence. I also activated my forward-facing takedown lights to illuminate the area, which was poorly lit.
Okay. And did your takedown lights have some effect on illuminating not just the cruiser in front of you, but the area in general where the male was standing?
Yes.
And when you got out of your cruiser, where did you go?
Once I got out of the cruiser, I actually walked diagonally towards Officer Hovey, who was now engaged with the individual.
And as you approached the individual, what, if anything, did you observe about his clothing or belongings?
I recall him wearing a blue or light blue hooded sweatshirt, shorts, socks, which were pulled up over his calves, and sneakers. He also had a backpack on as well.
Okay. And as you're approaching him, what view of him do you have?
I had
what
sort of a
Hold on,
side...
I'm sorry, sir, to interrupt you.
No problem.
So if you figure out Ms. McDougall's question before she finishes it, don't answer it.
Yes, sir.
Wait till the entire question's out so the court reporter can get the whole question out and get your whole answer, because we need a pristine record. The
Yes, Your
Superior
Honor.
Court's a court of record.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Now I don't even remember what my question was, but what side, how were you approaching him? From what side?
He would actually be like a side profile.
And could you tell whether he was in conversation with Officer Hovey?
Yes.
What, if any, conversation did you overhear as you approached?
Officer Hovey was asking him where he was from.
And how did the male answer?
He stated that he was from Tennessee.
And sir, at that point, were you able to see the male's face clearly?
Yes, I remember him. He was wearing a hood as I started walking towards him, and he took the hood off.
Okay. And the individual who you first encountered on the side of the road that early morning, do you see the individual in court?
Yes, I do.
Could you point him out and describe what he's wearing?
Glasses, suit, gray tie.
May the record reflect identification of the defendant.
No Creighton objection? Okay.
And so, sir, when you approached the defendant, did you have any conversation with him?
My conversation was slight. I asked him, what I reflect was he kept putting his hands into his front pockets of the sweatshirt. I asked him to repeatedly remove them from, so I could keep an eye on his hands for officer safety reasons.
And did he respond and remove his hands?
He complied, yes.
Okay. And did you ask him anything further in addition to anything you overheard Officer Hovey ask him?
My question was, where in the backpack? I asked him what was in the backpack.
And what did he tell you?
He said it was survival gear.
And what, if anything, did you do with respect to the backpack at that point?
At that point, I asked him if he could take it off and please hand it to me.
And did he do that?
He did.
And what, if anything, did you do with the backpack at that time?
I retained it.
Meaning?
I held on to it
Okay.
physically.
Okay. And at some point, did the conversation amongst yourself, Officer Hovey, and the defendant move locations?
Yes, at that point, considering the traffic, we were holding up traffic. We wanted to get into a safer, more well-lit location, so we moved to the rear of Officer Hovey's police cruiser.
And how much distance was there between Officer Hovey's cruiser and the front of your cruiser?
I probably gave at least 10 feet, 12 feet.
Okay. And when you were in that location, what, if any, further observations did you make of the defendant? Or conversation did you have with the defendant?
I think it was just more it continued as such of where he was coming from. It seemed as he wasn't really answering quite. He wasn't really paying attention to us. He would look past us, staring distantly past us.
Ultimately, did Officer Hovey have him remove some items from his pockets?
He did.
And were you able to observe what those items were?
I would.
And generally, what were they?
In the left pocket, there was a stack of plastic cards, and in the right pocket was a rock.
And was there any further conversation generated by the cards?
By the cards, we noticed on the top of it was a Massachusetts driver's license to a female.
And at that time, sir, had you heard anything about Colleen Ritzer or anyone else being missing out of Danvers?
The only missing was a 14-year-old male that we previously, at the start of our shift, was passed on by patrol officers that Danvers police had entered in a missing 14-year-old juvenile.
Okay. And the individual you were in contact with at that time, the defendant, prior to him saying his name, did you have any inkling he was the missing 14-year-old?
I did not.
Had you seen any photographs yourself of the missing 14-year-old?
I did not.
And had you gotten any physical description of him prior to starting your shift?
I did not.
Okay. At some point, did the defendant say his name?
He did.
And when he said his name, did you recognize that?
I did.
And what, if any, steps did you or Officer Hovey take with respect to learning his identity?
At that point, we notified our dispatch to notify Danvers Police that we had found Mr. Chism.
Did the tone of your encounter with the defendant change at all upon learning he was the missing teen out of Danvers?
Yes.
Can you describe that, please?
Again, very elated that we had found this 14-year-old teen. We were excited to actually hopefully get him home.
And did you have any further conversation with him, though, between the cruisers regarding the identification and credit cards that he'd had on his person?
We asked him where he had come across these IDs.
What did he tell you?
He stated he found them at a Stop and Shop.
And did you question him further?
Asked him, which Stop and Shop.
What did he tell you?
He stated he didn't know.
And are you aware of where the closest Stop and Shop is to where you made contact with him?
Approximately 2 miles south of our location in Danvers.
And was there any further conversation at that time about the origins of the identifications or the cards?
I don't believe so.
What was done at that point to, I believe you said earlier, get the defendant home?
At that point, we had heard back from Danvers Police. Danvers Police asked us to transport him back to their police station. They were dealing with another incident.
Okay. And was there a reason that you didn't immediately transport him to Danvers?
At that point, with 2 police officers on patrol, and given the jurisdiction of where Danvers Police is, there was actually unsafe practice. So we figured we wanted to actually maybe get him off the side of the road, bring him back to our police station where it was warm, and we can make further arrangements at that point.
At the risk of paraphrasing you, if one of you went to Danvers, there's only be one officer in Topsfield?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what distance was it to your police station at that time?
Approximately half a mile.
Okay. And how did the defendant get from your location back to the station?
We asked him to, get into Officer Hovey's cruiser where it was warm and we can get him to a safe location. So we guided him into the rear of the cruiser.
Okay. And did he get into the cruiser?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And when you arrived back at the police station, what, if anything, did you do to get him upstairs?
At that point, we just walked him upstairs, guiding him where to go, brought him into the booking room, which is on the 2nd floor, and had him take a seat on the wooden bench in the booking room.
Okay. And were you present while Officer Hovey inventoried the contents of his bag?
Yes.
Did you hear, let me ask you this, from where were you standing with respect to Officer Hovey and with respect to the defendant?
Okay. Our booking counter, so to speak, is approximately 4 feet high, rectangular in shape. An officer who would be booking into the computer would be on one side, and an individual on the wooden side. So I was right in the middle, right along the plexiglass.
Did you have a view of the items that Officer Hovey was removing from the bag?
Yes.
And were you present when he opened the wallet, and could you see what was in the wallet?
Yes.
What did you hear Officer Hovey say at that time?
He asked if there was anything dangerous in the bag.
Was that earlier when he was first opening the bag?
Yes, ma'am.
And how did the defendant respond?
He stated yes.
And once Officer Hovey had opened the white wallet, and could you see the box cutter?
Yes.
What did you hear Officer Hovey ask at that time?
He asked who the blood belonged to. Whose blood was it?
And how did the defendant respond?
He said, it's the girl's.
What did you do at that time, Officer DiBernardo?
At that point, we ceased questioning and advised him of Miranda rights through our juvenile form.
And when you say through your juvenile form, what did you physically do?
Physically produced a form, went over each Miranda step by step so he could understand each, and had him sign the form.
Did he indicate to you that did he respond to you verbally at all as you did that?
He understood each of the line items, yes.
And how do you know that? Did he tell you? Did he check? What did he do to indicate to you that he understood?
He said yes on each and then signed.
And at some point, did Officer Hovey then leave the room?
He did.
Did you have any further conversation with the defendant at that time?
I did have a brief conversation.
And what was that?
I asked him if we could, if he knew where the girl was.
What did he tell you?
He stated that she was buried in the woods.
And what did you ask him next?
I asked him if we can get to him, can we help her?
And what did he tell you?
He said no.
And while you were having that brief exchange with him, where was the defendant looking?
Kind of down, kind of away. Again, had that distant stare, really couldn't keep eye contact. So.
And after, as you were, let me ask you this, what was your proximity to the defendant at this point when you're having the conversation with him about where the girl is?
2 to 3 feet.
And and fair to say the lighting in the booking room was better than the lighting on the road?
Much better.
Okay. Did you have an opportunity to make observations of the condition of his clothing at that time?
I did.
What, if anything, caught your attention?
The sleeves of his hooded sweatshirt had a brown reddish stain. I also noticed a mask, or like a ski mask, that was down around his neck. That actually had some brown reddish stain as well. And the sneakers had brown reddish stain.
And as a result of those observations, what, if anything, did you do with respect to his clothing?
At that point, we seized those clothing and we placed them into brown bags.
May I approach this witness, Your Honor?
Sure.
Do you have gloves? I believe right here. Showing you an item, Officer DiBernardo, do you recognize that item?
Yes, ma'am.
And how do you recognize that item?
This was the mask that was worn by Mr. Chism around his neck.
And if you could look at it and tell me if it's in essentially the same condition it was in when you first noticed it in the police station that night.
Yes, ma'am.
And does that item, is there a hole in the top or just, so when he had it over his neck?
He
just describe
pulled
that?
this back and around his neck.
Okay, so where should be sort of the mouth opening was where he had his head through?
Yes.
Okay. I'd ask this be marked as the next exhibit. Your Honor.
Muted.
Exhibit 15. Showing you another item. Officer DiBernardo, do you recognize that item?
Yes, ma'am.
And how do you recognize that item?
This was the hooded sweatshirt that Mr. Chism was wearing.
And is that in essentially the same condition that it was in when you took it from him that evening or early morning?
Yes, ma'am.
I would ask this be marked as the next exhibit, Your Honor. And Officer DiBernardo, if you could just show us what you were referring to on the cuff
Yes, ma'am.
of that sweatshirt.
When I could see the left, the right, I could see these brown reddish stains. That's what first caught my eye.
Sir, showing you two other items, do you recognize those?
Yes,
What do you recognize those to be?
those are the sneakers Mr. Chism was wearing that morning.
And if you could just, are they in essentially the same condition they were in when you observed them that evening?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you just direct the jury to where you saw some reddish stains on those?
Sure. On this right shoe, I noticed on the front part here, and there was some along the siding here as well. On this. Yeah, and there's some along the toe here, and then along the bottom part over here as well.
And that's on the left sneaker?
Left sneaker.
I'd ask those be marked. Showing you two more items, Officer DiBernardo. Understanding they may not be that distinct. Do you recognize those?
Yes, these were the socks that he had.
Okay. And you indicated they were pulled all the way up, I think you said, when you first saw him on Route 1.
Yes, ma'am.
And are those in essentially the same condition they were in when you observed them on the defendant that early morning?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd ask those be marked as the next exhibit. I placed another item in front of you. Do you recognize that, Officer DiBernardo?
I do recall, yes.
And what do you recognize that to be?
This was the undershirt, the T-shirt that he was wearing.
And he was wearing that under the sweatshirt when you first saw him on Route 1?
Yes, ma'am.
And you didn't take that evening, is that correct? You just recognized those as being things he was wearing?
Correct.
I'd ask this be marked as
Never.
And finally, showing you one more item, Officer DiBernardo, do you recognize that item?
Yes.
And what do you guys recognize those to be?
These were the shorts that Mr. Chism was wearing.
And are those essentially in the same condition they were in when you saw them that morning?
Yes, ma'am.
And the credit cards and the rock, where did those items come from?
Those came from the pockets.
Of those shorts?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd ask those be marked as the next exhibit. After the defendant told you no when you asked if you could help the girl in the woods, did you have any further conversation with him before he left the station?
No.
Did he ask you anything?
No.
Okay. During the rest of the time, did you stay with him to observe him?
Yes, I did.
And ultimately, who actually transported him from there to Danvers?
I did, under the direction of State Police Sergeant O'Connor.
Okay. And what vehicle did you use?
My primary patrol vehicle.
His demeanor, the way you've described it, sort of looking past you, did
Yes.
that continue for the rest of the time you were present with the defendant?
Yes, ma'am.
And you didn't have any further conversation with him, nor did he instigate any conversation?
No, ma'am.
If I could just have one more.
Sure.
I have nothing further, Your Honor, with this witness.
So, how cold was it out there that night?
I remember it being approximately 40 degrees.
And did you form any judgment or opinion about the appropriateness of the clothing that Mr. Chism was wearing out there on Route 1?
I felt being in shorts, the light sweatshirt, it was not appropriate for the conditions. It was chilly.
Then you saw the belongings in his backpack being emptied out by your fellow officer, correct?
Yes.
Was there any warm clothing in the backpack?
Not that I recall.
No thermals or sweaters or anything?
Not that I recall, sir.
All right. And that teal blue sweatshirt that I think you may still have in front of you, Exhibit 16. How heavy is that?
Rather light material.
It's a light material. It's certainly not a heavy sort of hoodie you might see someone wearing during the winter.
Correct, it is not.
There was no pair of long pants in the backpack?
There was not.
And you drove him, were you alone in the car when you drove him to the Danvers police station?
Yes, I was, sir.
Did you try to have any conversation with him at all?
No conversation.
Did you make any effort?
No, sir.
Okay. And he didn't say a word the whole time?
No, sir.
Did you have any trouble getting him out of the cruiser when you got to Danvers?
No, sir.
Did he comply with all the directions you gave him?
Yes, sir.
But always without acknowledging you or looking at you?
Never really had any direct contact stare, but
Just the stare?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Any redirect?
No,
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do is recess a bit early today. We're well on schedule. Every day I'll tell you whether we're on schedule, ahead of schedule, or behind schedule. But we're well on schedule right now as we've started off. It's very important when you get home today and when you interact with other people that you maintain your seriousness and indeed vigilance in not letting anybody discuss the case in any way with you and not talking about it with anybody else. You can obviously see television cameras in the courtroom and print media in the courtroom, and the case is going to be covered extensively. That means that you have to be proactive. You have to work really hard at avoiding any information. And if you inadvertently happen to be in a room where there's a conversation or something comes on the television or the radio, that you immediately leave. I also want to ask you to do your best to get here early enough so that we can try to start as close to 9 o'clock as we possibly can every morning. Do not discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else. Don't do any independent research concerning the case. Avoid any information from any source other than in the courtroom, and the jurors are excused until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All right. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons having anything further to do before the Honorable David Lowy, Justice of the Superior Court, now sitting at Salem, within and for this county of Essex at present, depart and give your attendance at this place Tuesday morning next at 9 a.m., to which time and place the sitting of this court is now adjourned. Jurors, if you'll leave your notebooks right on your seat, and the officer will take you out. Come in.
Defendant have any issues that need to be discussed as it relates to the evidence tomorrow?
I believe the Commonwealth's first witness is Colleen's mother, and I believe there was a motion in limine relative to her. I don't plan to do any of the things the motion suggests, but it hasn't been acted on.
Okay. This is basically to humanize...
Correct.
Okay, yes.
Your Honor, I just asked that the court limit the testimony of Mrs. Ritzer to basic biographical material and any relevant testimony that you can give concerning the day in question.
Okay, thank you. As it relates to relevant testimony beyond the humanizing that's allowed under the case law, obviously that may be given. And for the remainder of the testimony, the narrow area that the case law provides, that may be inquired of.
And, I would just put on the record that the parties reached agreement with respect to the two mothers both being exempted from sequestration despite the likelihood of their being called, and they've been present today. The Commonwealth had also filed a motion with respect to 3 named police officers to ask that they be excluded from sequestration. I don't expect to call any of them in my case in chief. There is a possibility I would call them, 1 or 2 of them, probably just 1 of them, in my rebuttal case, depending on the testimony, if it's offered of the defendant's mother. I don't believe that should change them being exempt from sequestration, where the entirety of their interview with her was recorded, but I believe the defense has a different position.
Okay, first of all, as to the adoption of agreement between counsel as it relates to Mrs. Ritzer and Mrs. Chism, that'll be adopted. As it relates to the sequestration to the 3 police officers, one of whom may be called, I'll hear from you on that, Ms. Regan.
I have no objection to the police officers, the 3 police officers, being in the courtroom despite the sequestration order. I assume they won't be at council table. Is that correct?
There's no room, Your Honor, so
Okay.
no, they will not be.
The only time I'd ask that Officer Tanzi and Trooper Cherry be excluded is during the testimony of Dr. Kincherf, because it's unclear at this point whether the defendant's recorded testimony will be allowed in through Dr. Kincherf. And in that case, then Bucheri and Tanzi would become quite relevant witnesses. So it's only for the testimony of Dr. Kincherf that I'd ask that those two law enforcement officers be excluded from the courtroom.
All right, and where that issue arises when the Commonwealth's experts on the witness stand beforehand, I'll address it. As it relates to that issue and the basis for the Commonwealth experts' opinion, I'll have you talk to Ms. Draper about a good afternoon to address that issue. I was thinking next Monday in the afternoon, but if council needs to have it heard earlier than that, I certainly can have it heard earlier than that.
I don't need to hear that motion heard. There is another motion the defense filed regarding evidence from the medical examiner's office. I would ask if that could possibly be heard tomorrow, as there are relevant parties who can be present tomorrow. They could come another day if it's necessary, but ideally I would ask that that be heard tomorrow.
Okay, but it's non-evidentiary, is that right?
Correct.
All right, is it something that we can begin now?
If I can just interject, I think probably I'm going to file an amended motion tomorrow that'll be ascended to, if I understand my
Okay, so
conversation.
I'll wait to see if there's an objection. If there's objection, we'll address it. And if there's not, then the agreement can be put on the record. If it and I understand this would be an agreement, not a stipulation. I just mentioned if there are any stipulations between the parties that we follow recent case law in that regard, Commonwealth versus Ortiz, and also if there are agreements between counsel. This has happened too many times in situations where there's DNA, where there's perfectly understandable agreements between counsel, but it's not on the record as it relates to Commonwealth versus Tassoni and Williams versus Illinois, that the court be informed of it and that the record reflect any agreements that are reached. Okay, anything else from the Commonwealth or the defense? Yes, Ms. Regan?
There was a motion in limine concerning the video of Ms. Ritzer speaking with a fellow teacher in the hallway.
We're not going to reach that until next week, if not the following week, Your Honor.
Oh, okay.
All right. Anything else? No? Okay, thank you. We are going to do our best to see if we can have all the jurors here and ready to come in the courtroom at 9 tomorrow morning. Court will be in recess.
All rise.